Smoke still rose from the valley 3 days later, thick and black against the pale morning sky, carrying with it the scent of burned timber and something far worse that Celine refused to name. She crouched behind the twisted remains of what had been her grandmother's apothecary, her fingers pressed against the cold earth, feeling the lingering echoes of violence that had soaked into the soil like poison. Her village, the only home she had ever known, was nothing but ash and memory now. 200 souls had lived in these mountain valleys, tending their gardens and livestock, practicing the old healing arts, living quietly beyond the reach of the kingdom's politics and wars. They had harmed no one. They had threatened nothing. And yet the Alpha King soldiers had come in the night with fire and steel, following orders that condemned them all as rebels and traitors to the crown. Celine had survived only because her grandmother had pushed her into the hidden cellar beneath the shop floor, sealing the entrance with the last of her fading magic before the soldiers broke down the door. She had heard everything from below, every scream and plea, every clash of metal, her grandmother's final defiant words before the silence came. For 3 days she had remained hidden, waiting for the soldiers to leave, emerging only when the forest had gone quiet except for the crows. Now she moved through the ruins like a ghost, searching for anything that remained, any piece of the life that had been stolen from her. Most bodies had been burned beyond recognition, but she found her grandmother near the shop's threshold, her weathered hands still clutched around a silver pendant that had somehow survived the flames. The pendant was old, older than Celine's 17 years, older perhaps than her grandmother's long lifetime. She had seen it before, glimpsed it occasionally when her grandmother dressed for the seasonal festivals, but had never been allowed to touch it. Now she lifted it carefully from those cold fingers, whispering apologies and prayers as she did. The silver was untarnished despite the fire, wrought in the shape of a wolf mid-leap, its eyes set with tiny chips of moonstone that caught the light with an inner glow. When her fingers closed around it, something shifted inside her chest, a warmth that spread through her veins like liquid starlight. And for just a moment she heard voices, ancient and distant, calling a name that was not quite hers but felt familiar nonetheless. Before she could make sense of the sensation, rough hands seized her from behind, dragging her backward as a deep voice commanded her to stop struggling. Celine fought instinctively, her healer's training making her acutely aware of pressure points and vulnerable spots. But her captor was strong, far stronger than any human, and she realized with cold dread that the soldiers had not truly left at all. They had been waiting, watching for survivors, and she had walked directly into their trap. There were 3 of them, all wearing the black and silver of the king's guard, all with eyes that glowed amber in the shadows, marking them as wolves of considerable power. The one holding her was tall and scarred, his grip professional and unyielding, while the other 2 watched with weapons drawn and expressions of grim satisfaction. They bound her wrists with iron chains that burned against her skin, a burning that told her these chains were meant specifically for wolves, infused with silver and spelled to suppress shifting. But Celine had never shifted, had never felt the call of the wolf, despite her grandmother's assurances that the gift ran in their blood. She was a healer, nothing more, trained in herbs and poultices, in setting bones and easing fevers. Whatever wolf blood she possessed had apparently passed her by, leaving her entirely human and helpless against these predators who served the king. They dragged her through the ruins without explanation, ignoring her questions, and threw her into a wagon already occupied by 2 other survivors, both elderly, both too injured and shocked to speak. The journey to the capital took 5 days. 5 days of rough roads and hostile silence, of meager rations and freezing nights. The guards rotated shifts but never spoke to their prisoners, except to give curt orders. Celine tried to tend to the other survivors as best she could with bound hands, using what little healing knowledge she could. Apply without her tools or herbs, but one of the elders died on the 3rd night, simply closing his eyes and not opening them again. The other, a woman named Marta, who had taught Celine to read when she was small, lasted until they reached the capital's outer walls, before her breathing finally stopped. By the time the wagon rolled through the massive gates of Blackthorn Keep, Celine was alone with corpses and guards, who looked at her with something between pity and contempt. The capital was larger than anything Celine had imagined. A sprawling city of stone and steel that climbed the mountainside in terraced levels, with the royal palace crowning the highest peak like a dark jewel. Blackthorn Keep was a fortress as much as a palace, its walls thick enough to withstand sieges, its towers bristling with guards and weapons. They took her through a side entrance, down into the bowels of the keep where the dungeons waited, cells carved directly from the mountain stone and sealed with iron bars that reeked of silver. Her cell was small and cold, furnished with nothing but a thin pallet of straw and a bucket in the corner. They removed the chains only after locking her inside, and the relief from the silver's burn was so intense that Celine nearly collapsed. She had no idea why she had been brought here instead of killed with the others, no idea what purpose she could serve to a king who had already taken everything from her. For 2 days, she saw no one except the silent guard, who pushed a tray of bread and water through the slot in her door twice daily. She spent the time examining every inch of her cell, searching for weaknesses or opportunities, finding none. The pendant still hung around her neck, hidden beneath her shirt, somehow overlooked during her capture. At night she held it, feeling that strange warmth pulse against her skin, hearing those distant voices grow slightly clearer, speaking words in a language she did not know but somehow understood. They spoke of bloodlines and destiny, of thrones stolen and queens hidden, of a reckoning that had been postponed but never forgotten. On the 3rd day, they came for her, not the regular guards but soldiers in ceremonial armor, their expressions carefully neutral as they escorted her from the dungeons up through the keep's winding corridors. Celine walked between them with her head high, refusing to show fear even as her heart hammered against her ribs. They brought her to a great hall, vast and cold, its walls hung with tapestries depicting battles and hunts, its floor polished marble that reflected the light from massive chandeliers overhead. At the far end of the hall, elevated on a dais of black stone, sat the throne, and upon the throne sat the man who had destroyed everything she loved. Alpha King Cale Blackthorn was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 at most, his face carved in harsh lines that spoke of both nobility and cruelty. His hair was black as midnight, worn long enough to brush his shoulders, and his eyes were the deep gold of a wolf in hunting mode, cold and calculating as they swept over her. He wore black leather and dark furs, a crown of twisted silver resting on his brow, and even from across the hall, Celine could feel the power radiating from him. The raw dominance that marked him as an alpha of alphas, the strongest wolf in the kingdom. Flanking him were advisors and courtiers, all watching her with varying degrees of curiosity and disdain. And she realized this was not a private audience but a public spectacle. The guards forced her to her knees before the dais, but Celine kept her eyes locked on the king's, refusing to lower her gaze in submission. She saw surprise flicker across his face, quickly masked, and something else she could not name. The hall fell silent as he studied her, the moment stretching until she thought she might scream just to break the tension. Then he spoke, his voice deep and resonant, carrying easily through the vast space. He asked her name and she gave it. Her voice steady despite everything. He asked if she knew why she had been brought before him, and she said she did not, that she knew only that he had murdered her people and destroyed her home for crimes they did not commit. A ripple of shock ran through the assembled courtiers, and one of the advisors, a thin man with calculating eyes, stepped forward to demand she show proper respect to her king. But Kyle raised a hand, silencing the man, his gaze never leaving Celine's face. He told her that her village had been harboring rebels, enemies of the crown who sought to overthrow the rightful order of the kingdom. He told her that the old ways, the magic and traditions her people clung to, were dangerous remnants of a failed past that had no place in his modern realm. He told her that justice had been served, that the guilty had been punished, and that she stood before him now only because his scouts had reported something unusual about her, a magical signature that warranted investigation rather than immediate execution. Celine felt rage boil up inside her, hot and poisonous, but she forced it down, forced herself to think clearly. This man believed his own lies, or had been fed lies by those around him, and arguing would accomplish nothing except perhaps her death. Instead, she asked what he wanted from her, and he told her that she would be tested by the court mages, her abilities assessed, her loyalties determined. If she proved useful and cooperative, she might be permitted to live, perhaps even serve the crown in some capacity. If not, well, the dungeons held many who had proven less than useful. He dismissed her with a wave, and the guards dragged her back to her cell before she could respond, leaving her with more questions than answers, and a burning determination to survive long enough to understand what was truly happening. The tests began the next day, conducted by 3 mages who examined her with clinical detachment, probing her with spells that made her skin crawl and her head ache. They tested her magical capacity, her elemental affinities, her potential for combat or healing or divination. What they found confused them. She could see it in their whispered conferences and furrowed brows. Her magical reserves were substantial, far larger than expected for someone with no formal training, but they were locked somehow, inaccessible, as if sealed behind a door she did not have the key to open. Her healing abilities were genuine, but limited to the mundane, herbs and knowledge rather than magical intervention. And there was something else, something they could not quite identify, a resonance that appeared whenever they tested her bloodline, a signature that made their instruments flare with light and their spells rebound unexpectedly. After a week of testing, she was summoned before the king again, this time in a smaller chamber, a study lined with books and maps where Kale sat, behind a massive desk reviewing reports. He dismissed the guards, leaving them alone, and Celine felt her pulse quicken at the intimacy and danger of the situation. He poured 2 glasses of wine, offering her one, which she refused. He shrugged and drank both himself before speaking. He told her the mages were baffled by her, that her magical signature matched no known lineage in their records, that she was an anomaly that worried his advisors and intrigued him personally. He asked her about her family, her history, anything that might explain what she was, and she told him truthfully that she knew little, that her grandmother had raised her alone, that her parents had died when she was an infant, that they had always lived quietly in those mountains. What she did not tell him was about the pendant, which she still kept hidden, or about the dreams that had begun since her capture, vivid visions of a palace burning, of wolves screaming, of a woman with silver eyes like her own running through corridors while clutching an infant to her chest. She did not tell him about the voices that grew louder each night, or the growing certainty that her grandmother had hidden far more than healing knowledge from her. Instead, she asked him a question of her own, asked him how he could live with himself knowing he had slaughtered innocents, knowing he had orphaned children and widowed spouses based on lies. If you have something to share about this story, drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts, because I love hearing from you all. His face hardened at her words, the mask of kingly composure cracking just slightly to reveal something raw beneath. He told her she understood nothing of ruling, nothing of the impossible choices a king must make to preserve order and prevent chaos. He told her his kingdom had been on the brink of civil war when he took the throne 5 years ago, that rebel factions had threatened to tear everything apart, that hard decisions had been necessary to restore stability. He told her he regretted every death that came by his order, but that he would make the same choices again if required, because the alternative was anarchy and destruction, on a scale that would dwarf any village burning. His words were defensive, almost pleading, as if he needed her to understand, to absolve him. And Celine realized with shock that the Alpha King was not the monster she had imagined, but something more complicated and perhaps more dangerous. A man who had convinced himself that atrocities were justified by the greater good. She was returned to her cell, but the conditions improved after that conversation. She was given better food, clean blankets, even books to read. The guards began treating her less like a criminal and more like a guest, albeit one who was not permitted to leave. She learned from their gossip that the king had ordered her moved to the guest wing once space became available, that she was to be treated with courtesy, unless she proved hostile. It made no sense, this shift in her circumstances, unless the king was playing some longer game she could not yet see. She spent her days reading everything she could find about the kingdom's history, about the royal bloodlines and the wars that had shaped the realm, searching for clues about her own heritage and the mystery the mages had uncovered. It was in an old tome about the fall of the Silver Court that she found the first real answer. The book detailed how, 30 years ago, the ruling Silvercrest family had been overthrown in a bloody coup, how King Aldrich Silvercrest and Queen Thalia had been murdered along with most of their children, how their palace had burned and their line had been declared extinct. The Blackthorn family, previously a powerful but secondary house, had claimed the throne in the aftermath, arguing that someone had to restore order and that they had the strength to do it. Most of the realm had accepted this, weary of war and willing to follow any strong leader. But the book mentioned rumors, whispers that Princess Lyanna Silvercrest, the youngest daughter, had escaped the massacre, spirited away by loyalists who vanished into the wilderness. The rumors were dismissed as wishful thinking, the desperate hope of those who could not accept that the Silver Court had truly fallen. Celine stared at the words until they blurred, her hands trembling as she touched the pendant beneath her shirt. Her grandmother's name had been Lyanna. She had never known her grandmother's surname, had never thought to ask. But the age was right. The timing matched. And suddenly so many things made terrible sense. The isolation of their village, the careful avoidance of royal politics, her grandmother's occasional sadness when looking at the moon, the way she had sometimes called Celine Little Princess as a term of endearment. If her grandmother was the lost Princess Lyanna, then Celine was not just some village healer, but the, granddaughter of murdered kings, the heir to a bloodline everyone believed extinct, and the rightful claimant to the very throne Cale Blackthorn now occupied. The revelation should have filled her with triumph or purpose, but instead, she felt only crushing weight. What was she supposed to do with this knowledge? She had no proof beyond a pendant and resemblance, no army or allies, no training in politics or warfare. She was alone in the heart of her enemy's stronghold, powerless and ignorant, and revealing her heritage would likely result in her immediate execution. The Blackthorns had built their entire legitimacy on the extinction of the Silvercrest line. They could not afford to let a true heir survive, especially not now, not after consolidating power for 3 decades. She needed time to think, to plan, to understand the forces at play, before making any move that could not be taken back. Her opportunity came sooner than expected. A week after her discovery, the king summoned her. Again, this time to walk with him in the palace gardens. It was evening, the sun setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. They walked in silence for a time, guards following at a discreet distance, before Cale began to speak. He told her he had been thinking about their previous conversation, about her accusation that he had killed innocents. He told her he had reviewed the reports from her village raid, had questioned the soldiers and scouts involved, and had discovered discrepancies, evidence that the intelligence about rebel activities might have been exaggerated or fabricated entirely. He told her this carefully, his voice low, as if the words cost him something to speak. Celine stopped walking, turning to face him fully, searching his face for deception or manipulation. She asked him why he was telling her this, why it mattered what one village girl thought of his actions. He met her gaze, and she saw conflict there, guilt and pride warring beneath his controlled exterior. He told her that since meeting her, since looking into her eyes and seeing her refusal to break or bow, something had shifted in him. Some certainty he had always relied upon had begun to crack. He told her he did not understand it. This pull he felt toward her, this need for her good opinion that made no logical sense. He told her his wolf recognized her as something important, something precious, though he could not explain how or why. The word hung between them, unspoken, but understood. Mate. The bond that wolves could form, the connection that transcended logic or choice, marking 2 souls as meant for each other. Celine felt it too, had felt it from the moment she first saw him on his throne. a magnetic pull that made her want to move closer, even as her mind screamed at her to run. It was cruel beyond measure, this twist of fate that would bind her to the man who had destroyed her home, that would create desire and connection where only hate and grief should exist. She told him this, her voice shaking, told him that whatever bond existed between them was a curse, not a blessing, that she would never forgive what he had done, that she would rather die than accept him as her mate. Pain flashed across his face, quickly controlled, and he nodded slowly as if he had expected her rejection. He told her he was not asking for forgiveness or acceptance, only offering honesty, something he realized he had been lacking for far too long. He told her she was free to leave if she wished, that he would provide her with gold and safe passage to any territory beyond his borders, that she owed him nothing and he would demand nothing. The offer was genuine, she could sense it, but it also felt like a test, a way of seeing what she would choose when given freedom. She told him she needed time to think, and he accepted this, escorting her back to her chambers without pressing further. That night, Celine stood at her window looking out over the sleeping city and weighing her options. She could leave, start over somewhere new, live whatever life remained to her, or she could stay, learn the truth about what had happened to her family and her people, perhaps find a way to claim what was rightfully hers. The smart choice was to flee, to survive, but something stubborn and defiant in her refused to run. Her grandmother had spent 30 years hiding, protecting Celine by staying invisible, and it had accomplished nothing except ensuring. They both remained powerless when violence came. Perhaps it was time to stop hiding, to step into the light and claim the name that was her birthright. Consequences be damned. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because this story is about to get intense. She made her decision. The next morning she requested an audience with the king, and when she was brought before him in his private study, she reached beneath her shirt and pulled out the pendant, letting it hang visible against her chest for the first time since her capture. She watched his eyes widen in recognition, watched the color drain from his face as he stared at the wolf symbol, the moonstone eyes, the mark of House Silvercrest that every wolf in the kingdom would know from their history lessons. She told him her grandmother's name was Lyanna, that she had died protecting Selene in a village that was slaughtered for the crime of harboring the last remnants of the old royal line. She told him who she was, what she was, and she watched his entire world shift and crack with the implications. Kale was on his feet instantly, his hand going to the sword at his hip before stopping, his instincts at war with each other. His eyes flickered gold as his wolf rose close to the surface, and Celine braced herself for violence, for denial, for the rational response of a king confronted with a rival claimant. But what came instead was a question, barely whispered. He asked if it was true, if she could prove it. And she told him the pendant was proof enough, that such artifacts were tied to bloodlines and could not be worn by anyone outside the royal house without burning them. She invited him to test it himself, to touch the silver and see what happened. He approached slowly, cautiously, reaching out to brush the pendant with one finger. The moment he made contact, the moonstone eyes flared with brilliant white light, and a shock of power threw him backward, sending him stumbling against his desk. The pendant grew warm against Celine's chest, and suddenly the voices in her head were not distant but clear, speaking in unison. They proclaimed her Princess Celine Silvercrest, last daughter of House Silver, rightful heir to the throne of wolves, and they demanded recognition from all who could hear. The power in the room was palpable, ancient magic responding to bloodline and truth, and when the light finally faded, Kale was on his knees, his breathing ragged, his eyes wide with shock, and something that might have been awe. The silence that followed was absolute. Selena stood frozen, as shocked by what had happened as Kale appeared to be, the pendant still warm against her skin, but quiet again. Kale slowly rose to his feet, his movements careful, controlled, his expression unreadable. He told her to sit, his voice hoarse, and she did, watching as he paced the room like a caged animal, thinking and processing. Finally he spoke, asking her what she wanted, what she intended to do with this revelation. She told him the truth, that she did not know, that she had discovered her heritage only days ago and was still struggling to understand what it meant. She told him she wanted justice for her people, answers about what had happened to her family, and the truth about the current state of his kingdom. What followed was the strangest conversation of Selena's life. Kyle, instead of imprisoning her, or calling guards, or denying everything, began to talk. He told her about inheriting a throne at 25, about the advisors who had guided him, about the Council of Lords who effectively ruled in his name while he learned to navigate politics and power. He told her about the constant pressure to prove himself, to be strong enough to hold a fractured kingdom together, to make hard choices without showing weakness. He told her he had trusted his council's intelligence reports, had believed their assessments of threats and rebels, had signed orders without questioning, because he had been taught that a king who hesitated was a king who would fall. And now, looking back with clearer eyes, he was beginning to see the pattern of manipulation, the way he had been shaped and controlled, pointed at targets that benefited certain powerful interests. He told her something else, too, something that made Selene's blood run cold. He told her that 5 years ago, just before he took the throne, his father had discovered evidence that the fall of House Silvercrest had not been the righteous rebellion it was portrayed as, but a coordinated assassination orchestrated by a coalition of lords who wanted a weaker, more controllable royal house. His father had been gathering proof, preparing to reveal the truth and make amends, when he had died suddenly of a supposed heart failure. Kyle had been crowned within days, young and unprepared, immediately surrounded by the same advisors who had served his father and steered him toward policies that consolidated their own power. He had suspected nothing until recently, until meeting Selene and having his certainty shaken, until he started asking questions and noticing how often the answers did not quite align. Selene listened to all of this with her mind racing, seeing the bigger picture emerge. The same forces that had murdered her family had likely murdered Kale's father, had manipulated events to ensure a young, controllable king who would do their bidding. They had probably ordered the attack on her village the moment they discovered Lyanna's whereabouts, eliminating the threat before it could grow. And now Selene and Kale, two people who should have been enemies, found themselves as the only ones who could challenge the true powers that had been ruling from the shadows for 3 decades. The mate bond between them was not coincidence, but perhaps some last gambit of fate or magic, trying to unite the bloodlines and restore balance. She asked him what he planned to do, whether he would have her executed to protect his claim to the throne. He laughed, a bitter sound without humor, and told her that throne had never truly been his to begin with, that he was beginning to understand he had been a puppet ruler all along. He told her he would not harm her, would help her if she would allow it, that perhaps together they could uncover the full truth and decide what justice actually looked like. It was a tentative alliance, born of mutual need and the undeniable pull of the eye. Mate bond neither could fully ignore, but it was a start. They began working together in secret, meeting late at night in Kale's private chambers, where they could speak without being overheard. Kale gave Selene access to royal archives, to records and documents that painted a fuller picture of the kingdom's recent history. She discovered that the coup against her family had been brutal and thorough, that nearly every Silvercrest loyalist had been hunted down and killed in the months following the fall. She found records of her parents, learned that her mother, Princess Elena, had married a common healer, that they had lived in hiding for years before being discovered and murdered when Selene was only 2 years old. Her grandmother Lyanna had taken her and fled further into the wilderness, changing their names, using old magic to hide their traces, living in fear, but also in hope that someday the truth would emerge. Kale, meanwhile, investigated his advisors, carefully and quietly, documenting connections and financial trails that suggested a conspiracy far larger than either of them had imagined. The Council of Lords who advised him were not loyal servants of the crown, but members of a shadow organization that had been manipulating royal succession for generations, ensuring that only weak or controllable wolves held the throne while they wielded the real power. They had allowed the Blackthorns to rule because Kael's grandfather had been amenable to their influence, but when Kael's father had grown a conscience and started investigating, they had eliminated him and rushed his inexperienced son into power. The evidence was damning, but it was also dangerous. If the council learned that Kael was investigating them, or that a Silvercrest heir had survived, they would act swiftly and without mercy. Selene and Kael had to be careful, had to play their roles of king and prisoner publicly, while building their case privately. The strain of maintaining the deception wore on them both, but it also drew them closer together, creating a partnership built on trust and shared purpose that transcended the mate bond. Selene found herself seeing past her hatred of the man who had ordered her village destroyed, seeing instead the person underneath who had been as much a victim of manipulation as she had been. Their growing connection did not go unnoticed. Lord Valen, the head of the council and Kael's chief advisor, began asking pointed questions about why the prisoner from the mountain village had not been executed, or at least relocated to a more secure location. Kael deflected, claiming he was still investigating her unusual magical signature. But Valen's suspicion was clear. They needed to move faster, to gather the last pieces of evidence and make their move before the council realized what was happening. Selene suggested they reach out to the outlying packs, the territories beyond the capital where the council's control was weaker. But Kael worried that any communication would be intercepted and used against them. The break they needed came from an unexpected source. A young mage in the palace, a woman named Cora, who had been part of the team that tested Selene, approached them with information. She had overheard 2 council members discussing plans to eliminate Kael and replace him with a more compliant cousin, a plot that was apparently already in motion. Cora had family who had been loyal to the Silvercrest line, and she had recognized something in Selene during the testing that made her suspicious. When she researched the old bloodline markers and compared them to her results, she had realized what Selene was, and she wanted to help restore the rightful line. With Cora's assistance, they began planning in earnest. They would need to expose the council's crimes publicly, in a way that left no room for denial or spin. They would need allies, wolves powerful enough to stand against the council's enforcers, and they would need to present a united front, showing the kingdom that the old and new royal lines stood together rather than divided. It was ambitious and dangerous, and failure would mean death for all of them. But doing nothing was no longer an option. The opportunity came during the Winter Moon Festival, a yearly celebration when all the major packs and lords gathered at the capital for a week of ceremonies and political maneuvering. The council would be present, along with potential allies and witnesses from across the kingdom. Kael announced that he would be making a major proclamation on the final night of the festival, and rumors immediately began swirling about what it might be. Some thought he would finally name an heir. Others whispered about new laws or military campaigns. No one suspected the truth. Selene spent the weeks before the festival training with Cora, learning to access the magic that had been locked inside her. The pendant was the key, she discovered, a focus that her grandmother had created to seal away Selene's power until she was ready to claim it. With Cora's guidance, she learned to open that seal, to let the magic flow freely, and when she did, the change was dramatic. Her eyes, which had always been pale gray, began to glow with silver light when she used power. Her healing abilities amplified 1,000-fold, able to mend wounds with a touch and cure sicknesses that would have taken weeks of treatment. And she could feel the wolf inside her finally. A presence that had always been there but sleeping, waiting for her to acknowledge her true heritage. Her first shift was both terrifying and exhilarating. Kael was with her when it happened, coaching her through the process. And when she finally let go and allowed the transformation, she became a wolf unlike any the kingdom had seen in generations. Her fur was pure silver, gleaming like moonlight, and she was large even by alpha standards, marking her as royal born. Kael's wolf, massive and black, with golden eyes, bowed to her instinctively, recognizing her authority, even if the human minds were still working out their partnership. They ran together through the forest beyond the palace walls, and for a few precious hours, Selene felt truly free for the first time since the massacre. The night of the proclamation arrived with the palace packed with visiting wolves and the great hall prepared for the announcement. Selene stood in the shadows behind the throne, dressed in silver and blue, the colors of House Silvercrest, wearing the pendant openly now. Cale had insisted she be visible for this, that the kingdom see her and understand the significance of what was being revealed. The hall fell silent as Cale stood, his presence commanding immediate attention. And he began to speak. "I want you to hit that like button if you're enjoying this story because your support means everything." He told them about the investigation he had conducted, about the evidence he had uncovered of the council's manipulation and crimes. He told them about his father's murder, about the systematic elimination of anyone who might challenge the conspiracy's power. And then, he told them about Selene, about who she was, and what her existence meant. The hall erupted into chaos, lords shouting denials and accusations, guards moving toward the throne with hands on weapons, and Lord Valen's face twisting with rage as he realized his carefully maintained control was slipping away. Cale raised his hand, and the alpha command in his voice cut through the noise, forcing silence through sheer dominance. He called Selene forward, and she stepped into the light, letting them all see her clearly. He invited anyone who doubted her heritage to test the pendant, to try and touch the artifact that would burn anyone not of Silvercrest blood. Several lords approached, skeptical, and each one recoiled from the flare of power when they tried to make contact. He presented the documents they had gathered, the evidence of conspiracy and murder, and he called for a vote of no confidence in the current council, demanding a full investigation by neutral parties from the outlying territories. Lord Valen tried to seize control of the situation, declaring Cale unfit to rule and calling for his arrest, but the other lords were not following his commands anymore. The evidence was too damning, the revelation too shocking, and wolves who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the council's overreach saw an opportunity to break free. Fighting broke out as council loyalists clashed with those ready to rebel, and Selene found herself in the middle of combat for the first time in her life. Her training with Cora paid off as she used magic to shield allies and disable attackers, her healing power also capable of causing pain when directed with intent. Kyle fought at her side, his combat skills honed by years of training, and together they held the throne against all challengers. The battle was brutal, but brief, ending when the majority of lords declared for Kyle and Selene's side, isolating the council members who surrendered rather than face execution. By dawn, the Great Hall was secured, and the old power structure lay in ruins. The aftermath was complex and exhausting. Trials had to be held, evidence presented, justice served to those who had committed crimes, while mercy extended to those who had been following orders in ignorance. Kyle insisted on transparency, on public proceedings that left no room for future conspiracy theories or hidden resentments. Lord Valen and his inner circle were found guilty of treason and murder, their titles stripped, their lives forfeit. Others who had participated in lesser crimes received exile or imprisonment, depending on their level of involvement. Through it all, Selene and Kyle worked together, presenting a united front to the kingdom. The question of who should rule, who had the rightful claim, was settled in a way that surprised many. Kyle publicly acknowledged that the throne had been stolen from House Silvercrest, that Selene's claim was superior to his own, and he offered to step down if she wished to rule alone. But Selene, seeing the man he had become, seeing his genuine commitment to justice and reform, made a different choice. She proposed they rule together, united by the mate bond and by shared purpose, combining the strength of both bloodlines to create something new and better than what had come before. The kingdom, weary of conflict and hungry for stability, accepted this compromise with cautious optimism. Selene and Kyle were formally bonded in a ceremony that combined the traditions of both their houses, and they took the throne together as king and queen, equal partners in power and responsibility. It was not a perfect solution, and there were still those who harbored resentment or plotted in the shadows. But it was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild on a foundation of truth, rather than lies. In the months that followed, Selene threw herself into reforming the kingdom's policies. She established new laws protecting outlying villages from arbitrary raids, created oversight committees to investigate intelligence reports before military action was authorized, and founded healing centers across the realm where anyone could receive care regardless of their status or pack affiliation. Kyle supported all of this while focusing on rebuilding the military and diplomatic corps, purging corrupt officers and replacing them with wolves who had proven their integrity during the crisis. They also searched for other survivors of the old purges, finding a handful of Silvercrest loyalists who had been living in hiding for decades. These elders were brought to court and honored, their stories recorded for history, their knowledge of the old ways preserved and taught to a new generation. Celine learned from them about her family, about the grandmother who had sacrificed everything to keep her safe, about the mother and father she had never known, but who had loved her enough to die protecting her future. The mate bond between Celine and Kale deepened as they worked together, evolving from an awkward biological pull into genuine love built on respect and shared experience. They learned each other's strengths and weaknesses, learned to communicate and compromise, learned that leading together was far more effective than either could manage alone. There were still difficult moments, times when Celine's grief over her lost village surfaced, or when Kale struggled with guilt over his role in past injustices, but they faced these challenges together, supporting each other through the healing process. One night, nearly a year after the revelation that had changed everything, Celine stood on the balcony of the royal chambers looking out over the capital. The city below was peaceful, its lights twinkling like stars, and she could hear distant music from a Yule festival in the lower districts. Kyle joined her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder, and they stood in comfortable silence for a time. She told him she had been thinking about her grandmother, about the choices Liana had made, and the price she had paid for keeping the bloodline alive. She told him she understood now why her grandmother had chosen to hide rather than fight, that sometimes survival was the bravest choice when the odds were impossible. Kale told her that her grandmother would be proud of what she had accomplished, of how she had taken the heritage she was given and used it to build something better. He told her that he was proud too, that she had shown him what true strength looked like, that she had saved him from becoming the kind of king he never wanted to be. She turned in his arms to face him, seeing the love and devotion